Macedonian police pinned down by bullets from above. The frustration starts to show as they seem unable to stamp out ethnic Albanian rebels firing down from a mountainside. Fire breaks out as Macedonian forces pound the mountain with heavy machine gun fire. Police also use shoulder-fired grenades, but the rebels appear to stubbornly hold on. Nearby, a Macedonian family packs its belongings and flees, like hundreds of others have already. A few blocks away, the town's first victim, an Albanian man, mourned by his family, shrouded in an Albanian flag. He was struck by a bullet, authorities say from a rebel sniper. Relatives say by a Macedonian sharpshooter. The clashes in the mountains here are the deepest yet inside Macedonia and the closest to a major city. Macedonian security forces are trying to keep the fighting from turning into urban warfare, which could have far wider repercussions. Tetovo is an ethnic patchwork quilt of Albanian and Macedonian neighborhoods, and a conflict here would be devastating. What is not clear is how much local Albanian support there is for the rebels. The fighting began a day earlier during a demonstration for greater Albanian rights in Macedonia. Protesters cheered the rebel gunfire. Police appeared caught off guard by the rebels and quickly sent in armored personnel carriers to try to quell the fighting. Macedonian authorities say some 200 rebels from Kosovo crossed the border to stage attacks around Tetovo, as they have in other border areas. There was another cry for help from Macedonia, for NATO-led KFOR to do more to help crush the rebels.
We will ask for the direct involvement in a confrontation by NATO and KFOR for the situation in the Republic of Macedonia.
At the moment, though, KFOR's mandate is limited to enforcing the peace in Kosovo and does not extend here. Chris Burns, CNN, Tetovo, Macedonia. Goran Stojanovski, a 28-year-old policeman and father of two, his picture carried and caressed by a cousin. Among thousands who filled the streets of Kriva Palanka to say farewell to a native son. A painful farewell after Stojanovski was killed when ethnic Albanian guerrillas attacked a Macedonian convoy near the Kosovo border. After winding through town, the procession stopped at a church. Family members were overcome with grief during the service. Stojanovski was the latest Macedonian policeman to die in clashes in recent weeks with the increasingly bold rebels, operating along the rugged, mountainous Kosovo border, as well as in a buffer zone in southern Serbia proper. Though they demand more autonomy and rights for ethnic Albanians, who make up at least a quarter of the population in Macedonia, their support appears limited here. Some say the rebels are hiding behind political claims to maintain lucrative smuggling. The Macedonians received more diplomatic support, this time from the visiting French foreign minister. Back in Kriva Palanka, a final farewell at the cemetery for Goran Stojanovski. His wife kissed his badly bruised face as family members were overcome with grief. Loved ones blamed the Macedonian government and NATO-led KFOR forces for not doing enough to stem the violence. The government is guilty for all this, she said. Shame, said another.
The shame for the American, the shame for the NATO, isn't it?
Macedonia has been praised for a measured response to the rebels. The question is, how many more funerals will it take for the government to crack down harder and risk driving a dangerous wedge between the Slavic and Albanian communities? Chris Burns, CNN, Kriva Palanka, Macedonia. Armed with flags, signs, and banners, thousands of ethnic Albanians gathered for what was billed as a march for peace and freedom. We are not terrorists, they chanted. They condemned ethnic Albanian fighters who recently clashed with Macedonian security forces near the Kosovo border.
Today I am here because the Albanian people in Macedonia like a peace.
We asking for peace. We asking ours right as a people.
The march was organized by the Democratic Party of Albanians, the DPA, part of the governing coalition. The DPA has condemned the violence. However, there is a growing movement in Macedonia for greater rights for the Albanian minority. Albanians make up more than a quarter of Macedonia's population, and with their high birth rate, that figure is rising. That's translating into greater political power and demands for broader rights guarantees. Specifically, demands to amend the constitution to establish a republic that formally recognizes the status of Muslim Albanians in this majority Orthodox Christian land. Among the demands, make Albanian one of the official tongues and provide higher education in that language. Macedonian President Boris Trajkovski says there's room for dialogue, but not if rebels are involved.
We believe in ballots, not in bullets. Yeah. And I think that they should achieve their goals, what they state, their demands through the legal roads and through the legal paths.
But a warning from the Albanian opposition: the longer reform is delayed, the greater chance a rebel movement could gather steam.
If our efforts to solve the problems through the institutions doesn't give the results, I am afraid that maybe in the future more of them will think that it's not sense. There is no sense to stay in the institutions with no results.
Macedonia was the only republic to split from Yugoslavia without bloodshed. In a land where Macedonians and Albanians have long coexisted, there are warnings, but also hope the current ethnic divide can be breached. Chris Burns, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. The guns lay silent but ready. Macedonian flags fly at this machine gun nest on the edge of Tetovo for the first time after a week of fighting. But security forces remain on a war footing here as time ticks away on a government ultimatum. A midnight deadline for ethnic Albanian rebels to lay down their arms or face a renewed offensive by Macedonian forces. After a week of fighting, an eerie calm, but one that could be shattered at any moment. Government forces are holding their fire right now, but only if the rebels hold theirs. A barrage the evening before pounded rebel positions on the hillside above Tetovo, the beginning, the government said, of its final offensive to crush rebels they call terrorists. In the aftermath of the artillery barrage, shattered houses on a deserted hillside. Townspeople wait anxiously to see if the lull holds. Making up more than 1/4 of the country's population, ethnic Albanians have been demanding more rights, but are content to remain part of Macedonia. The guerrillas have co-opted the demands, but some commanders have gone further, calling for a separate ethnic Albanian state. Among many ethnic Albanians, pessimism neither the guerrillas nor the government will back down.
We are worried because there will be more bombing if the rebels don't give up their gun.
While some ethnic Albanians and ethnic Macedonians see only a military solution, others in both communities hope for a dialogue.
We will be living together and we would like to live together peacefully.
Concern too among German KFOR forces at a base on the edge of Tetovo. Most of the 1,000 troops stationed here have been moved to a camp out of town.
We will continue to use this base. We have warehouses here with vehicles and supplies. We're not going to give that up.
But Pole says that could change if the fighting spreads. Germany has sent several tanks to protect the base. In another telling sign, Macedonia's army placed tanks in defensive positions around Tetovo, in case the fighting gets as far as the city. It's a nightmare scenario the government hopes to avoid. Chris Burns, CNN, Tetovo, Macedonia.
Is that right? Yes, because they will first start shooting with small cannons. They miss the vehicle.
A rebel ambush on a convoy on a deserted mountain road near Tetovo, an attack that could have been far worse.
And 2 people fall out of the car and escape in that direction.
The rebels didn't miss with their second rocket-propelled grenade, destroying the vehicle. More than a dozen troops and police in 2 other vehicles also jumped out and took cover. They drove off the rebels in a firefight. One policeman was wounded in the shoulder. Security forces heavily reinforced the area in an attempt to track down the guerrillas. This police official, who declined to be identified, says the rebels' motive is obvious.
We can just guess what is their meaning, but actually they're properly trying to say that they will not stop with their action against our forces.
The clash came as a new government of Slavic Macedonians and ethnic Albanians issued an ultimatum for rebels holding northern villages to lay down their arms and withdraw by Thursday noon or face attack. The ambush here shows the conflict could spread again to the mountains above Tetovo, already battered by weeks of bitter fighting. Macedonian forces retook this area back in March, but their hold on this no man's land is sometimes tenuous. Last month, another ambush killed 4 policemen and 4 soldiers. That attack helped set off the fighting around the town of Kumanovo that threatens to flare up again. The rebels contend the new government will pay only lip service to demands for more rights for the ethnic Albanian minority and that they must fight on. The rebel defiance poses a test to the new so-called unity government as it tries to grant more rights to the Albanians and reestablish control on the ground. Chris Burns, CNN, near Shipkovica, Macedonia. In the small mountain village of Nikushtak, an ethnic Albanian family prepares the body of one of its sons for burial. Artillery can be heard in the distance. 22-year-old Jetele Miftari was shot by Macedonian police after helping bring humanitarian supplies to a nearby village, cut off by more than 10 days of fighting. Authorities have been on the lookout for arms shipments to the rebels. As Miftari's body is washed, loved ones cling to his feet. His infant son watches, held by Miftari's brother, as he's lowered into the coffin. Miftari's father, a truck driver based in Austria, watches bewildered. "You're on the street and suddenly you're shot," he said. "I don't understand." The women come to grieve, some not wanting to say goodbye. The coffin makes its way to the cemetery. Miftari is passed from hand to his final resting place. How Jetele Miftari died has 2 versions, exemplifying a climate of mistrust. Authorities say a police patrol fired on Miftari when he turned his car around and tried to flee. Villagers say Miftari fled after police opened fire. Mistrust is jeopardizing hopes of ending both the military conflict and the political crisis here. Government forces have fought ethnic Albanian rebels to a standoff. The rebels refuse to withdraw, demanding inclusion in talks about greater rights for the Albanian minority. Meanwhile, a key ethnic Albanian party is demanding a ceasefire before joining a so-called Grand Coalition government aimed at settling the crisis. Back in Nikushtak, the father of Jetele Miftari helps lay his son to rest. Miftari's brother watches and cries. Frustration grows among the villagers. They say Albanians remain second-class citizens a decade after Macedonia's independence from Yugoslavia. After 10 years, we still need more jobs. Our schools are broken down, he said. Albanians and Macedonians should stay together, but we need to build together. A hope that is fading as a deadly stalemate drags on. Chris Burns, CNN, Nikushtak, Macedonia. The face of defiance. Ethnic Albanian fighters at a rebel checkpoint in the besieged village of Slupčane. They search cars, much like Macedonian security forces on the other side. The atmosphere is friendly. They're guerrillas of the National Liberation Army, or NLA, demanding more rights for ethnic Albanians, rejecting government promises for political dialogue with Albanian parties. As an uneasy ceasefire appears to hold, but for how long? No indication the rebels are going anywhere, even though the government is threatening to attack, now that its deadline for the rebels to withdraw has expired. The toll from nearly 3 weeks of off-and-on fighting is visible everywhere. Homes, farmhouses, a mosque. Villagers say many livestock have been killed. Underground, women, children, and the elderly are hunkered down. No plans to leave, though conditions are worsening as they run low on food and medicine. We are born here, we will die here, this woman says. The NLA aren't terrorists. They are from our village. They are fighting for our rights. Though no rebel commander was available for comment, another villager expresses his support. The people here don't want to leave because their sons and daughters are on the front line, he says. More civilians from other villages did agree to leave, evacuated by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which took advantage of the tenuous halt in fighting. Women and children, no longer able to endure the siege, fleeing to safety, leaving behind thousands of others.
The situation is difficult. There are a lot of civilians. They have no water. They are very short in food. Medical supply is difficult. Hygiene is very difficult also. Lack of water. Psychological pressure on them. I mean, war is going on, so they're suffering.
Suffering likely to worsen as the standoff continues and threatens to explode again into open warfare. Chris Burns, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. An armored personnel carrier near the front line in the mainly ethnic Albanian village of Matece, behind checkpoints cordoning off the area. Police move under heavy guard. The guerrillas hold the next village over. Few of the 3,000 residents here are on the streets. Most are staying inside. Though fighting has ebbed, many here have little hope the formation of a broad new governing coalition of ethnic Albanian and Macedonian parties will force the rebels to leave. I don't know. That depends on the ones from the other side, said this Macedonian man, referring to the rebels. The government aims to grant more rights to ethnic Albanians to undermine support for the guerrillas. If the politics point toward reconciliation, the situation on the ground remains tense here. A few hundred meters over my shoulder are rebels who reject the political process. Until they can be part of it, they say they'll keep on fighting. One ethnic Albanian mother says gunfire nearby has kept her family inside, sometimes in the basement. The father shows bullet holes from a recent clash. Police check Albanians and their cargo. Though the atmosphere is friendly, it's also cautious. It's a good situation, he says. Nothing's happening here. But the local police chief acknowledges a tense standoff with some 40 rebels hiding in houses on the edge of the village. For days, security forces and rebels in some dozen other villages have fought to a draw. One police commander in the area, who asked not to be identified, claims the rebels could be driven out in a matter of hours. We're talking about a lot of people who are not directly involved in this situation, he said, but they are prisoners there. We don't want to hurt those people. The hope is that the standoff will end if the new governing coalition addresses the Albanians' political demands for more job and educational opportunities, leaving the rebels without a cause. So far, promises have yet to change the mood here. Chris Burns, CNN, Matece, Macedonia. At Macedonia's parliament, the first day of a new government, a broader though fragile coalition of Slavic Macedonians and minority ethnic Albanians, aimed at solving a dangerous standoff in the countryside. A standoff in which thousands of ethnic Albanian villagers remain pinned down as rebels demanding more rights for Albanians face off with government forces. The battle sparked a verbal firefight in parliament the night before, giving the government a rocky start. Prime Minister Ljupčo Georgievski called the rebels terrorists. We have to stabilize and secure the country, he said. We'll do the maximum preparations, politically, militarily, and materially, to crush the forces of this enemy. One ethnic Albanian party nearly quit the coalition in anger. It was coaxed back by U.S. and European diplomats. Still, the acrimony remains.
Mr. Georgievski, he had a good opportunity to send a message that he is prepared to do everything to stop bombing and killing. But from our point of view, he didn't do it.
But one Slavic Macedonian analyst sees Georgievsky addressing Macedonian fears.
You have also to take care about their interests, about their fears, about their readiness and political preparedness to discuss issues. Because if you go too far, then you have Bitola.
Thus the concern over granting too much too fast to ethnic Albanians who are demanding more job and educational opportunities. And the will to keep up the pressure on the rebels, who still reject the political process. But Albanians say the government needs to move more quickly to address their concerns, or it could fall, possibly leading to a broader civil conflict. It's a nightmare that could force both sides in the government to find some common ground, with help and pressure from the international community, so that a slow burn conflict doesn't escalate out of control. Chris Burns, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. Red Cross vehicles ferried dozens of ethnic Albanian villagers to safety. Villagers who spent more than 10 days hunkered down in the foothills of Macedonia, several hundred yards from the tanks that were firing in their direction, pinned down by a government siege of villages held by ethnic Albanian rebels. Most of them are women and children. Some are mothers-to-be. Some needed medical care. With them came tales of terror and worry for those left behind. So many are living in basements without food, water, medicine, said this pregnant woman. I left because I'm mostly afraid for my children. First, there's a ceasefire in the morning, and then Macedonian forces start shooting, he said. When we go out of the basement, they start firing grenades. The International Committee of the Red Cross says thousands of other villagers are still pinned down or refusing to leave their homes. The Macedonian army announced a dawn-to-dusk ceasefire to give villagers a better chance of fleeing. The ceasefire appeared aimed at easing efforts to reach a grand governing coalition of ethnic Albanian as well as Slavic Macedonian parties. That coalition, announced in a brief statement after intense talks Friday, is to grant greater rights and opportunities to the Albanian minority in an attempt to defuse the crisis. It remains to be seen how and when that agreement will change the situation on the ground for thousands of villagers. Any political deal depends on whether the fighting will cease and the rebels desist. But some guerrilla commanders are thumbing their noses at the political process unless they can be included in it. That could mean more fighting unless the rebels can be successfully isolated. Isolated politically and militarily, if a governing coalition can seize the initiative, and if Macedonia and its neighbors, including NATO-led KFOR, can cut off the flow of weapons to the guerrillas. Critical variables that could determine how soon thousands of villagers will no longer live in fear. Chris Burns, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. After a night of sporadic clashes, a day of relative peace near the besieged village of Vaksinse. As the noon deadline passed for ethnic Albanian rebels to lay down their arms or withdraw from a string of villages, not a shot could be heard. Government forces have been poised to launch an onslaught to drive the guerrillas out. But shortly after the ultimatum's deadline expired, the government said it would give more time for civilians to evacuate and for peace efforts to press on. Officials said more than 1,500 villagers left in the 24 hours leading up to the deadline and that more appeared ready to leave. This ethnic Albanian family left the mainly Albanian village of Matece, fearing the fighting could spread there. We are leaving because of this ultimatum, he said. No one was bombing the village, but it's a mixed village. Meanwhile, diplomats used back channels, including Albanian leaders in Kosovo, to press the rebels to back down.
We're at the pivotal point, the decisive moment, the moment of truth, and we just are confident that the Albanian side will muster the strength to make the right decision.
Diplomats say the rebels could agree to a pullback in exchange for amnesty and rehabilitation for local fighters under international monitoring. Diffusing the crisis would buy more time for the fragile new multi-ethnic governing coalition in Skopje to address Albanian demands for more rights. The alternative is too horrible to imagine, President Boris Trajkovski told the nation the night before. The alternative is a divided society entangled in war. If the deadline for the rebel pullout came and went, security forces have been showing restraint for several reasons: international pressure and concern over casualties, among civilians and perhaps the government itself. Chris Burns, CNN, near Vaksinse, Macedonia. Macedonian President Boris Trajkovski showing himself on a war footing, visiting his troops who are facing off with ethnic Albanian rebels, but also showing restraint, as the international community has been calling for, even though a government deadline for the rebels to withdraw has expired. He came with a message to his troops.
To encourage them that they have to be in a position to overcome the attitude of the terrorists because they're trying to involve our country in the civil war, in bloodshed, and we have with this attitude to overcome all this, and at the very same time to resolve the situation politically and military terrorists to be isolated.
After some 2 weeks of fighting, rebels and security forces are still eyeball to eyeball. The international community is pressuring the rebels to withdraw and the government to continue holding its fire. Mainly out of concern for thousands of civilians who haven't evacuated from rebel-held villages, many hiding in their basements. Those who have fled describe deteriorating conditions. There's also domestic pressure from ethnic Albanians in a new governing coalition demanding more rights for the Albanian minority, threatening to quit if civilians are killed. And pressure from Slavic Macedonians who urge the government to attack now before it's too late. One Slavic analyst says the rebels' aims are more than political.
Look, these people are fighting for territory, they're not fighting for democracy. If it caused the coalition government to fall down, then be it.
It's a balancing act President Trajkovski faces, trying to hold the country together as he seeks the least violent way out of the crisis. Chris Burns, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. The village of Vaksinse, a ghost town. Government forces claim to control it after driving the rebels out. As the police-led convoy enters the village, the destruction is immediately apparent. Shells of houses, bullet-riddled and burned during 3 weeks of on-and-off battles, with rebels fighting for greater rights for ethnic Albanians. Macedonia's interior minister pays a quick visit, praising his troops, predicting government forces will take the rest of the rebel-held villages in a matter of days. This action, in cooperation with the Ministry of Defense, has been very successful, he said. Slowly and carefully, Macedonia is returning to peace, and we have managed to save the hostages, he said, referring to civilians. But the tour on the edge of Vaksinse lasts a few minutes. Police and troops sight rebels somewhere inside the village. As the troops advance, reporters are told to leave. Security forces retook this village after fierce house-to-house fighting. The pockets of resistance show the battle isn't over. What's more, the rebels can fall back into the hills and strike again. Battles rage in nearby villages as the government presses on with its offensive. Thousands of civilians have fled, but thousands more remain holed up in their homes. Among those who fled Vaksinse, Recep Demiri, suffering from throat cancer, unable to get treatment for weeks, unable to speak because of the advancing disease. His wife speaks of desperate conditions in a basement with more than 100 people afraid to leave because of the crossfire.
We had no medicine, there were no doctors, we couldn't go out, we had no food, no water.
As the suffering grows and the battles continue, tension has risen between Slavic Macedonians and minority Albanians in the 2-week-old governing coalition. Albanian leaders have threatened to quit the government if civilian casualties continue to mount. That, some analysts fear, could signal the beginning of a civil conflict. Chris Burns, CNN, Vaksinse, Macedonia.
The Macedonians began their long-promised offensive with heavy mortar barrages of suspected rebel positions in the hills above Tetovo, the country's second-largest city. Smoke poured out of houses where it is believed the rebels had taken up defensive positions. The Macedonian government hoped the increased artillery shelling would soften the ethnic Albanian rebel positions so that a convoy of armored personnel carriers and infantry would encounter less resistance as they advance for the first time toward the high ground which the rebels have held for the last 12 days. Soviet vintage T-55 tanks belonging to the Macedonian government finally came out of their bunkers and growled through the town at the crack of dawn. The tank's value in the mountains may be marginal, however, because of the steep inclines, because of limited maneuverability, and because the rebels are believed to have anti-tank weapons. The Macedonian government began ratcheting up the pressure Saturday when it employed for the first time helicopter gunships firing rockets into these same hills. By escalating the fighting, some analysts have warned the Macedonian government now risks creating even more sympathy among the country's largest ethnic minority, the Albanians. Still, Macedonian President Boris Trajkovski downplayed that risk.
I think that there is no sense among the Albanian population to be on the side of the terrorists here.
Macedonia's Slavic majority cheered the beginning of the offensive against the ethnic Albanian rebels. But while the Macedonians may be cheering, the international community has until now urged the government here to show restraint in dealing with the rebels. That restraint appeared to end today. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. A Macedonian army sergeant moves fresh troops to the front at Tetovo. This even as NATO approved deployment of 3,500 troops to collect the ethnic Albanian guerrillas' weapons. Both Macedonians and the guerrillas have pledged to cooperate with NATO's campaign to stave off what the West clearly fears could turn into the Third Balkan War in 10 years. NATO is hurrying troops here, fearing delay could lead to another outbreak of fighting. These French troops could begin gathering the ethnic Albanian guerrillas' weapons as early as next week at 5 different collection sites. But what are NATO's orders if its troops come under fire?
If we have been shot at, we will use force in self-protection.
The guerrillas are supposed to turn in 1/3 of all their weapons by August 31st. But 1/3 of what? NATO military analysts now say they may never have an accurate estimate of the number of guns in the ethnic Albanian guerrillas' arsenal. They say they just hope the guerrillas turn in enough guns to placate the Macedonian government. And even now, these Western military sources report the guerrillas continue to try to smuggle in new weaponry to replace the guns they're about to turn over to NATO. One weapon the guerrillas seem unlikely to give up is shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles they acquired to shoot down Macedonian army helicopters. NATO and Macedonian sources confirm the guerrillas have these missiles. Macedonia's interior minister told CNN he thinks NATO's weapons collection plan is only symbolic. Ultimately, everyone agrees it's up to the Macedonians and the ethnic Albanians to decide their future, either by political compromises or by the guns which both sides will still have after NATO goes home. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. NATO buildup in Macedonia continues even without the political green light for Operation Essential Harvest to proceed full throttle. This advance guard came to persuade the warring parties to observe a ceasefire so NATO can proceed with its limited mission of collecting the guerrillas' weapons to give peace a chance.
The ceasefire must remain durable and effective before our forces can arrive and complete their role of receiving the weapons and ammunition.
400 British troops are expected this weekend. 3,500 NATO soldiers could follow if it's safe. NATO and Macedonian helicopters hopped around the airport as NATO troops began to pour into Skopje amid new misgivings about NATO's mission here. 3,500 NATO troops began entering Macedonia to take part in collecting weapons from ethnic Albanian guerrillas. This even as Russia's President Putin voiced grave doubts about whether this undertaking will bring stability to this tiny Balkan country. A British Army captain offered a soldier's perspective.
Really, you've got to be prepared for absolutely anything. We don't know that there's a lot of tension between the two sides. There's always going to be ethnic factions, hardliners that will try and rebel.
Even as a German Luftwaffe Hercules joined in Operation Essential Harvest, there were also grumblings in Berlin questioning the wisdom of the operation. Much now depends on the quality and quantity of the weapons these ethnic Albanian guerrillas decide to surrender. But again, the means for turning in the guerrillas' guns has more than a few loose ends.
That process is still under development. There's a lot of negotiation that must go on with both sides to ensure that actually there is a transparent and clear understanding of how that process is going to be conducted.
As these newly arrived British soldiers sat alone with their thoughts on a bus, wondering what the next 30 days will bring here, Macedonians themselves were less than assured by NATO's grand design for defusing the insurgency against the government by ethnic Albanian guerrillas.
The next couple of years, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 50 years, we are going to have a real problem with Albanian separatists whose final aim is definitely to take part of Macedonia, to divide Macedonia.
NATO does not have years, but only 1 month. In the end, it will not be the soldiers, but the politicians in Brussels and London who will judge whether this operation is a success. And they must weigh that judgment carefully, lest the conflict flare up again after the NATO soldiers go home. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. A Czech Air Force plane flies in Czech paratroopers to provide protection for British commanders of a NATO force. The Czechs, the British, and other NATO units know Macedonia is less than a friendly environment.
We can expect also some, let's say, dissatisfied elements to try to hinder the mission.
All the arriving troops also know many Macedonians believe NATO has tilted toward the ethnic Albanian guerrillas as they waged their war against Macedonia since February. This NATO advance guard, to be led by the British, is here primarily to see if it's safe enough to bring in more troops later. Then upwards of 4,000 NATO soldiers could come in to collect weapons the guerrillas voluntarily surrender. The ethnic Albanian guerrillas have yet to work out the technical details for giving up their weapons. They've reportedly indicated they will turn over 2,000 guns. The Macedonian government says they must give up 8,000 weapons. And the amnesty agreement for the guerrillas may fall short of what these ethnic Albanians say they need. There remain more questions than answers now. For example, NATO says it's not here to protect anyone. So who protects the guerrillas from reprisals once they give up their guns? NATO's answer: we're relying on the trust and goodwill of both sides. The problem is both those commodities have been in very short supply here. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. The ethnic Albanian guerrillas have some surprises for NATO and the Macedonian government when they start turning in their weapons, like this T-54 tank captured from the Macedonian army during the fighting for Raduša. The guerrillas proudly gave CNN this exclusive glimpse of their Soviet-era prize. And the guerrillas have more, at least 2 armored personnel carriers they took from the Macedonian army. Of course, this one is bullet-scarred and there are 2 flat tires, but the UÇK guerrillas are pleased as punch to show it off. Still, the guerrillas did announce they will turn in their weapons to NATO on a phased basis as long as Macedonia approves constitutional reforms giving minority Albanians here equal rights. The guerrillas' reclusive political leader, Ali Ahmeti, made his debut before the Western media to declare the war is now over. Wanted by the Macedonians for alleged war crimes, he portrayed himself as a man of peace who now wants reconciliation with Macedonia. The guerrilla leader also tried to put aside NATO fears, Ali Ahmeti saying the UÇK, the National Liberation Army, guarantees the security of NATO troops, adding there will be no problems on our side. There are more than a few flaws in the NATO weapons collection plan, and Western military analysts acknowledge some extraordinary blind spots in their intelligence. NATO hopes to collect between 2,300 and 3,000 guns from the guerrillas, including some 120mm mortars. But they also acknowledge that Macedonian estimates of the guerrillas having upwards of 6,000 guns could also be correct. In mountain villages, the guns fell silent and the ceasefire appears to be taking hold as these children cheered the UÇK, the ethnic Albanian guerrilla army, whom they see as heroes. But elsewhere, in villages like Raduša, there was evidence the ethnic Albanians paid a frightful price. Many of the human residents have become refugees. If the ceasefire holds, NATO may yet collect the Macedonian tank, but with modifications. Before relinquishing it, the guerrillas say they're going to paint it red with the UÇK insignia all over it. Walter Rogers, CNN, with the ethnic Albanian guerrillas in Macedonia. Flying their battle flag and sporting bright red and black guerrilla army insignias all over their captured T-55 tank, these ethnic Albanian soldiers say they're now ready to relinquish their weapons to NATO. Not to be turned over just yet, however, are the Macedonian prisoners the guerrillas hold. There are more than 20 according to the International Red Cross. These three say they just turned down the wrong road in June and were captured. Guerrillas suspected them of spying. They say they've been treated well and have been promised no harm will come to them.
Are saying it's just about over and things straighten up, no problem, and go home.
Meanwhile, in Skopje, Macedonian politicians argued with NATO over the numbers of weapons NATO will be collecting from guerrillas. Prime Minister Ljupčo Georgievski said the NATO estimates are ridiculously low. He says the guerrillas have 80,000 weapons and that NATO's weapons calculations will only lead to war.
That has not been presented as the official response to NATO from the government.
NATO spokesman Barry Johnson discounted the Prime Minister's numbers, saying Monday's weapons collection plan is still on track.
We, as I said, fully anticipate this process moving forward once the clarifications are made.
A British colonel tried to put the best possible face on a NATO mission that faces increasing skepticism.
The collection of weapons is but one part of a process, and that process, we hope, is heading towards peace and stability in this country.
Less sure of that peaceful future, however, are the ethnic Albanian guerrillas in northern Macedonia. They openly admit they will keep some of their weapons because they say they don't want to be left defenseless once NATO leaves after its 30-day mission ends. This guerrilla commander, known as the Professor, said if NATO leaves in 30 days, its mission will be a failure. In his words, for Macedonia to calm down, NATO must think in terms of years, not 1 month. These ethnic Albanians may be looking down the barrel of disappointment, however, because NATO insists everyone here will be on their own again sometime in September. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. Ethnic Albanian guerrillas shout for freedom and country. For this we will die, they yell, still maintaining their edge just in case war flares up again in Macedonia. The guerrillas eagerly await the arrival of NATO forces, even though they say they have whipped the Macedonian army. Still, in the words of this guerrilla commander, thank God it's over.
That's enough with killer. That's enough. He doesn't need any more to kill.
Although some dissident guerrillas say they will fight on, these National Liberation Army fighters say they are ready for NATO. If the Macedonian government honors the peace agreement it signed, we will disarm, this fighter said. We don't need our guns, this Albanian teenager told us, but he added, if we don't get our rights, we can get guns again. We fight in the name of God remains their battle cry, adding, don't worry, mother, your son is in the UÇK, the National Liberation Army, this even as they prepare to disarm. In these remote villages in northern Macedonia, the guerrillas enjoy widespread logistical support from civilians. Western military analysts say there is no shortage of ethnic Albanian volunteers, from this boy with a toy gun to 11- and 12-year-olds we saw with the real things. In their hideaways, guerrilla leaders listen as the Macedonian government television still describes them as terrorists, despite a peace agreement and a promise of amnesty. Amnesty is important to us, so we won't be prosecuted, this guerrilla leader told us. What has he learned? Sometimes, he said, peace has to be achieved with guns. It took a war to win what we won, he concluded. The fighters and ethnic Albanians in these mountaintop villages remain anxious. They say they're not going to get a good night's sleep until NATO forces actually arrive. That's why they say they're only going to turn in their guns in 3 stages, not all at once. And the suspicions are just as deep on the other side. Vlado Buchkovski is the Macedonian defense minister. This is just the beginning, the defense minister said, and I'm convinced there will be some others who will use force, and force will be used against them. The Macedonian government does not lack force, but its army has been driven out of the mountains. The ethnic Albanian guerrillas have plenty of fight left in them too. What's still lacking is good faith. Never trust Macedonians, he said. This is what NATO faces when it comes to disarm the guerrillas. Walter Rogers, CNN, in the mountains of Macedonia. Ethnic Albanian guerrillas strip weapons they know they must now give up in exchange for amnesty. You were fantastic, their commander told them, this after their 6-month insurgency against the Macedonian army. Then he announced their unit is disbanded and they should all go home. At the weapons collection point, a steel ring of French foreign legionnaires protected the perimeter even as machine gun fire was heard in the distance. Inside a warehouse, another guerrilla commander, having turned over several hundred weapons, said he did so because he believes he has guarantees from NATO. What NATO harvested was a few light mortars, a handful of heavy machine guns, landmines, grenades, and over 300 rifles. Still, many of the first day's weapons were museum pieces, and some of the rifles were much older than the soldiers collecting them. Missing were the sophisticated and newer weapons NATO had been hoping for.
Because we're not seeing them here now on this spot does not mean that they won't be coming in.
NATO will be collecting weapons over the next 29 days, moving its collection points almost daily. Even as they registered, bagged, and collected the weapons, many of these British soldiers mourned their first fatality of the conflict. Sapper Ian Collins was killed when a Macedonian youth threw a piece of concrete through the windshield of the vehicle he was driving.
Last night was a tragic event, and it's brought us all down to earth.
By night, firefights like this between the Macedonian army and the guerrillas are a constant reminder NATO is operating in less than a friendly environment and that there are still many guns out there on both sides. NATO officials acknowledge they still have no way of verifying what percentage of the guerrillas' arsenal these guns represent. They say their weapons collection plan only offers a chance for peace, and everyone here knows the real test of the intentions of both the guerrillas and the Macedonians comes after NATO goes home. NATO has but 29 more days here to collect the guerrillas' weapons on a mission in which the risks seem to grow daily. Walter Rogers, CNN, over northern Macedonia. A NATO soldier salutes an ethnic Albanian farmer's tractor, testifying to a more relaxed atmosphere as NATO's weapons collection moves ahead.
And I have talked with your officer.
The guerrillas banter easily with those come to take their guns. The ethnic Albanian fighters continue to disband in front of television cameras, but they are extremely pessimistic. This guerrilla said, "I don't believe the Macedonians have anything good in store for us, otherwise they would have treated us better before this." The weapons being surrendered ranged from ancient carbines to newer assault rifles. This guerrilla was sporting a modern anti-tank rocket launcher. And a British officer said the guerrillas here even turned in some smaller shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles.
The weapons will be bagged, tagged, put into the containers and flown out to a destruction point at Krivelak with the Greek battle group.
This NATO collection point was in an unfinished house in the mountains above Tetovo, a guerrilla stronghold. In the valley below, Macedonians, Orthodox Christian pilgrims, tested NATO's truce in their own way, lighting candles and praying in the rubble of the ancient monastery the guerrillas recently destroyed. It's a catastrophe, this Macedonian woman said. I pray it can be repaired. Repairing Macedonia, helping reconcile the ethnic Albanian and Slavic communities here is NATO's goal, and the arrival of France's Defense Minister Hélène Richard marked the beginning of a series of Western VIPs headed this way. Next comes NATO Secretary General George Robertson to urge a skeptical Macedonian parliament to ratify a peace agreement that gives the ethnic Albanians expanded rights, rewarding them for the guerrillas turning in some guns. Robertson may find Parliament a hard sell, however. Many Macedonians still see these ethnic Albanian guerrillas as terrorists, and Macedonians remain near total skeptics, suspecting the guerrillas are still sitting on large secret arsenals of weapons. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. This is not a Hollywood action movie. These are Tigers, paramilitary police that some ethnic Albanians fear the Macedonian government will unleash upon them once the guerrillas give up all their guns and once NATO goes home. The units are not Macedonian army, but serve under the Minister of Interior, Ljubša Boškovski, a political hardliner. NATO Secretary General George Robertson was so concerned, he warned Macedonians no illegal paramilitary must be allowed to operate here.
There must be no exceptions for those who break the law and the order of this country.
Boškovski has dismissed NATO's weapons collection program in Macedonia as symbolic. We will solve the terrorist problem on our own, he said. It won't be easy, but we will solve it. Some Tiger security police are already in the field. You can spot them because they wear ski masks to hide their identity. To those ethnic Albanian guerrillas giving up some of their guns and disbanding, the deployment of the Interior Ministry's police hiding their identity is anything but reassuring. None of the guerrillas have faith in the Macedonian government's intentions. To be a tiger in the jungle of the 21st century is to be a survivor, a winner, is the message of the Macedonian security recruiting video, broadcast in a country where NATO talks of building trust and peace. Perhaps also, with some justification, the Macedonians feel they need to polish up their military image after fighting an insurgency with the guerrillas to whom they actually lost territory. This call to join the Tigers recalls Macedonia's ancient glory under Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. It is also the stuff that captures the imagination of the next generation of Balkan children. But the promotion of these special security units, like the Tigers, may not exactly be what NATO officials have in mind when they speak of confidence building here. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia. A Macedonian man and his son-in-law inspect the home they abandoned at Lejšak after ethnic Albanian guerrillas overran the area a month ago. The announcement NATO has an agreement with the guerrillas on the numbers of weapons they will turn in inspired enough confidence among some Macedonians to re-enter territory still controlled by the guerrillas. NATO commander Major General Gunnar Lange gave the guerrillas a vote of confidence on the numbers of weapons they say they're prepared to surrender.
I believe that the numbers are credible now and close to our own intelligence assessments.
So Tripko Richtovski says he will try again to live with his country's ethnic Albanian minority, even though he returned to find his home ransacked and looted while the area was under guerrilla control. When these NATO soldiers begin collecting guns early next week, it's estimated they will harvest over 3,000 weapons, though they know they can never check all attempts to smuggle new weapons into the guerrillas from Kosovo. Hardliners in the Macedonian government, like Interior Minister Lube Boškovski and others, claim the guerrillas should turn in 85,000 weapons. But NATO says the counting will be done by its soldiers, not the Macedonian hardliners.
For the number they have declared they are willing to hand over, that is the number I'm going to collect.
NATO officials say they expect the weapons collection plan to commence and proceed smoothly now. Still, one diplomat warned, quote, "There are lunatics out there who want to push the events here in a different direction." He cited the recent shelling and destruction of a priceless Macedonian Orthodox monastery by guerrillas as evidence of the volatility of the situation. Just as important as weapons collection, however, is Macedonian politics. Next Friday, Parliament convenes to decide if the ethnic Albanian guerrillas have turned in enough weapons to proceed with political reforms addressing ethnic Albanian grievances. A two-thirds majority will be necessary to pass the reforms. And one Western official here said that vote a week from now will decide if there's going to be peace or war. Walter Rogers, CNN, Skopje, Macedonia.